Hey folks, Gary here with Cole, doing the daily Bible reading for Saturday morning, and we're continuing on with Romans 8, looking at verses 12 to 13. And it may sound like Paul is a broken record, and for those who are younger, what's a broken record? Well, it's when a broken record had a scratch in it. So a record was what you put on a turntable, you had an arm that came out with a needle on the end. That's how you got your music. But if it was scratched, it would keep skipping and repeating over and over again. That's what a broken record was called. And Paul almost sounds like that. He keeps repeating himself over and over again. Now, why is Paul doing it? Well, it's not because he's a bad preacher and he only has one point, and so he keeps making it over and over. Paul is doing this because it's really important. He's being led by the Spirit. He's saying, you need to get this. So he's saying the same thing over and over again. And so we see in verse 12, he says, my dear friends, we must not live to satisfy our desires. So again, he's saying, don't live according to your flesh. Don't live to satisfy the desires of your flesh. Don't do that. If you do, you will die. And, well, yes, I mean, we all will die physically, but you die spiritually. Don't do that. You've given your life to Christ, and that is awesome because he's talking to believers. Don't live by your old nature. Don't live by the flesh. Don't live by those desires. If you do, you're going to mess up this life you have with Christ. But he continues on, he says, but you will live, in other words, you'll live a great life with Jesus, if by the help of God's Spirit, the Holy Spirit, you say no to your desires. So if you slay those old desires, if you slay that old nature, and I know people are going to say, whoa, wait a second, you don't do that. God does that. That is true. It is God who takes care of our old nature, but don't leave it just up to God. Here's what I mean by that. There's always pendulum shifts that take place, okay? And there's the idea that, man, you got to make yourself righteous, you got to make yourself holy, all those kind of things. That's called self-righteousness, and that doesn't work. We know that. But then the pendulum shift went the other way, that it's God who does all this, and we just sit in the back and say, all right, and take a ride. That's not true either. Obviously, there is a responsibility that we have too. If there wasn't, then Paul wouldn't say, you say no, right? He wouldn't say, if by the help of. So obviously, you have a part in this too. You can't excuse your sinful behavior on God. You can't excuse bad practices on God and say, well, it's just God's will. You can't do that. It's not God's will. And people fall out of God's will all the time by following their own desires. And so it says, you do this. Now, can you do it on your own? No. Through the help of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will empower you to do these things, but you've got to say no. And you've got to say, I'm not going to do that anymore. And you've got to take that stand. And God will help you do it. And that's the awesome part. It's not that you do it on your own. It's not at your own righteousness. It's that God does it through you. But you got to take a stand to and say, I'm not going to live that way anymore. I'm not going to excuse my behavior either. I'm just going to take a stand and say no. And when you do, you truly start to live.